They told her she was a bad omen, a disgraced daughter swinging a notched blade in the dead of night, just trying to outrun the ghosts of her past. She thought the cold, moonlit courtyard was her only sanctuary. She thought she was entirely, perfectly alone. She was wrong. For 7 consecutive nights, the most dangerous man in the kingdom, the Alpha King himself, has been standing in the pitch-black shadows, watching her every strike, memorizing her every breath. And tonight, he's finally stepping into the light.
The courtyard was empty, as it always was at this hour. Claire liked it that way. The keep fell quiet after the evening meal, when the other soldiers retreated to the warmth of the barracks, and the cooks banked the fires in the kitchens. She had learned long ago that solitude was not something to fear, it was something to use. She drew her sword, plain steel, well-balanced, nicked in 2 places along the edge, from years of hard use, and settled into the first stance. The moonlight pooled silver on the flagstones, and her shadow stretched long and thin across the yard as she began to move. Form 1, the basic guard, taught to every recruit on their first day. She had practiced it so many times that her body knew it, the way it knew how to breathe. But she did not rush through it. She held each position, felt each shift of weight, corrected the angle of her wrist by a finger's width. The night air was cool against her face, carrying the scent of damp stone and the last of the spring lilacs that grew along the keep's outer wall. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a dog barked once and fell silent. She moved through the forms the way other women might recite prayers, quietly, devotedly, alone. Form 3, a pivot and a thrust. Her boots scuffed against the flagstones, and she adjusted her footing without breaking the rhythm. 10 years of practice had taught her that a sword was not a weapon first. It was a discipline, a way of holding yourself together when everything else fell apart. She had learned that lesson in the Northmoor Fells, in the cold years after her family's name had been dragged through the mud and her father's honors had been stripped away. She had been 14 when she picked up her first practice blade, too young to understand why the other children in the village think at her with suspicion, too old to pretend she did not notice. "You are the daughter of a traitor," the whispers had said. "You are bad luck. You are not welcome here." She had stopped listening after a while. She had started practicing instead. Form 5, a low sweep, then a rising cut. Claire's breath came even and controlled, the way her father had taught her before he died. "The sword is honest," he used to say. "It does not lie about who you are. It only shows you what you have become." She had become someone who did not need anyone's approval. She had become someone who could take care of herself. And if that meant spending her evenings alone in a cold courtyard, practicing forms that would never earn her promotion or praise, then so be it. She was good at being alone. She had had plenty of practice. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that she was not alone tonight. He had been watching her for 7 nights. Nathaniel, Alpha King of the Kingdom of Eldermere, master of Ashford Keep and its lands, stood in the shadow of the covered walkway that bordered the courtyard's eastern edge. He had dismissed his guards an hour ago, claiming he wished to walk the ramparts alone. It was a lie, and they had known it was a lie, but they had bowed and withdrawn anyway, because that was what guards did when their king dismissed them. He leaned one shoulder against a stone pillar, his dark cloak blending into the shadows, and watched the woman in the moonlit yard. She was small, smaller than most of the soldiers under his command. Her hair was pulled back in a single braid that swung against her back as she moved. Her leather armor was old, patched in places, clearly not issued by his quartermasters. She had brought it with her from wherever she had come, and think, then told him something about her circumstances. She was a Northmoor girl. He knew that much. He had made it his business to know, after the report had reached him. 7 nights ago, one of his personal guards, a man named Aldrich, who had served him for nearly a decade, had been brought to the infirmary with a wound taken during a skirmish on the northern road. Nothing life-threatening, the surgeon had said. A deep gash across the shoulder, but clean. He would heal. But Aldrich had not spoken of the wound. He had spoken of the woman who had bound it. She was traveling north with a supply wagon, Aldrich had told him, his voice hoarse from fever. "She saw me fall. She dragged me off the road before the horses could trample me. She used her own cloak to stop the bleeding, would not let me pay her, said. He had paused, frowning. Said she had a brother once, who bled the same way, said she hoped someone would have done the same for him. Nathaniel had listened without comment. He had noted the name in his ledger, Clare of Northmoor, newly assigned to the keep's lower guard. And he had told himself he was merely verifying the character of a new soldier. That was what he told himself. But he had come to the courtyard that first night, out of something more than duty. He had come because Aldrich's words had stayed with him longer than they should have. A brother once, a hope that someone would have done the same. He had expected to find a competent soldier going through her paces. What he had found instead was something he had not anticipated. She practiced like a woman mourning something. He watched her now, as she moved through her forms with a precision that spoke of years of repetition. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, no attempt to impress anyone who might be watched. Nifam. She moved the way a person moves, when they have long since stopped performing for others and have learned to perform only for themselves. It was, he realized, the most honest thing he had seen in months. The court of Ashford Keep was a theater of masks. His lords bowed and smiled and plotted behind his back. His advisors whispered counsel in his ear while sharpening their own knives. Even his own blood, what remained of it, had proven willing to trade loyalty for ambition. But this woman in the courtyard did not know she was being watched, and so she did what no one in the keep dared to do. She was simply herself. She finished the form and lowered her sword, her breath clouding slightly in the cool night air. She stood still for a moment, her head bowed, and he saw her shoulders rise and fall with a long, slow breath. Then she looked up. He should have looked away. He should have melted deeper into the shadows and let her finish her practice in peace, as he had done on the 6 nights before. But something in the way she lifted her chin, in the way her eyes swept the courtyard with the sharp wariness of someone who had learned not to trust the dark, held him in place, and she saw him. For one heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she was across the courtyard, her sword coming up in a smooth, practiced arc. And Nathaniel found himself with the point of her blade resting against the hollow of his throat. She was fast, faster than he had expected. The moonlight caught her face, the sharp line of her jaw, the pale scar that cut through her left eyebrow, the gray-blue eyes that met his without a flicker of fear. "Who are you?" she demanded. Her voice was low and steady, but he could hear the controlled tension beneath it. "What are you doing here?" He did not move. The blood, like a thing.d at his throat, was cold and very real, and he found, to his own surprise, that he was not angry. He was impressed. "A guard," he said, keeping his voice calm and even. "On patrol. I saw you practicing." Her eyes narrowed. "The patrols do not come through this courtyard. They walk the walls." "Then I was taking a different route. At this hour, I could not sleep." She studied him for a long moment, her blade still steady at his throat. He could see her weighing his words, testing them for truth. He could also see something else in her eyes. A wariness that went deeper than the situation warranted. A mistrust that had been learned the hard way. "Lower your sword," he said quietly. "I mean you no harm." She did not lower it. "You were watching me." "Yes." "How long?" He considered lying. He considered telling her that he had only just arrived, that he had seen her final form and nothing more. He did not. "Long enough," he said, "to know that you are very good with a blade." She blinked. It was a small thing, barely a flicker, but he caught it. The compliment had landed somewhere she had not expected it to land. She lowered her sword a fraction, then a little more, until the point rested against the flagstones at her side. She did not sheathe it, but she stepped back, giving him space. "You should announce yourself next time," she said. "Startling a soldier at night is a good way to get yourself killed." "I will keep that in mind." She looked at him again, and he saw her take in his dark cloak, his height, the way he stood with the easy stillness of a man who had spent his life learning to hold his ground. Whatever she concluded, she did not share it. "I am Clare," she said. "Of the Northmoor Fells." He inclined his head. He did not offer his own name. "I should finish Magot." "Think practice," she said, and there was a dismissal in her voice that he found oddly refreshing. No one dismissed the Alpha King. No one dared. but this woman did not know who he was, and she did not seem to care to find out. "Of course," he said. "I will leave you to it." He turned and walked back toward the covered walkway, feeling her gaze on his back. He had taken 3 steps when her voice stopped him. "Wait!" He turned. She was still standing where he had left her, sword in hand, moonlight silvering her hair. "If you are going to watch," she said, "at least stand where I can see you. It is unsettling to feel eyes on you in the dark." He almost smiled. He could not remember the last time he had almost smiled. "Very well," he said. "I will stand in the light." He stepped out of the shadow, into the edge of the moonlight, and he watched her finish her practice. She did not look at him again, but she knew he was there. And somehow that changed everything. When she finally sheathed her sword and walked back toward the barracks, her braids swinging against her back, Nathaniel remained where he stood. He watched her go until she disappeared through the door, and then he looked up at the moon, high and pale and indifferent above the keep. He had meant to observe her for one more night, perhaps 2, just long enough to satisfy himself that Aldrich's savior was trustworthy. Then he would have moved on, filed his notes, and forgotten her name. But now he had spoken to her. Now she had looked at him with those gray-blue eyes, unafraid, and told him that she would rather see him than feel his eyes on her in the dark. He had been wrong about something, he realized. He had thought he was done being surprised. The moon made no answer. The courtyard was empty again, silent except for the faint sound of the wind in the lilacs. Nathaniel turned and walked back through the shadows toward his chambers, and he did not believe for a moment that he would forget her name. The morning came gray and damp, as mornings often did in Ashford Keep before the sun climbed high enough to burn the mist off the stones. Claire was awake before the first bell, as she had been every morning since she arrived from the Northmoor Fells 3 months ago. She dressed in the dark, laced her boots, and ran her fingers once over the hilt of her practice sword before she left the barracks. She did not think about the man in the shadows, not on purpose anyway. The memory of those gray-green eyes kept surfacing at odd moments, the way a pebble will rise to the top of a jar no matter how many times you press it down. She had told him to stand where she could see him, and he had. That was the end of it. He was a patrolman doing his rounds, nothing more. The morning duties were the same as always. She swept the eastern corridor, hauled water from the well for the kitchen, and reported to the training yard for the morning drills. The yardmaster, a barrel-chested man named Sergeant Holt, ran them through sword forms until their arms ached and their breath came hard. Claire kept her mouth shut and her feet quick, as she had learned to do long ago. The other soldiers were young men from the southern valleys mostly, with easy laughter and easy confidence. They did not speak to her much, and she did not mind. It was during the midday break that she found the young soldier sitting on the bench by the armory door, his boot unlaced and his face tight with pain. She knew him by sight, a skinny lad named Doran, who had come to the keep only a fortnight ago. His ankle was swollen, already purply, thinking at the edge, and he was doing his best to hide it. She did not ask. She simply knelt, took his foot in her hands, and pressed gently around the joint. He hissed through his teeth but did not pull away. "It is not broken," she said. "But you will not be drilling tomorrow either. Sit still." She fetched a strip of clean linen from her kit, bound the ankle firmly, and helped him hobble to the infirmary. The healer was away tending a fever in the lower town, so Claire boiled water herself, mixed the herbs she found in the healer's stores, and wrapped the foot in a warm compress. Doran watched her with wide eyes. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said, "but I have time." She left him with the compress and a bowl of broth from the kitchen, and she did not think about it again until much later, when she learned that Sergeant Holt had noticed. He said nothing to her directly, but he gave her a single nod as she passed him on the way to the afternoon drills. It was more than she had received in 3 months. The afternoon passed in the usual rhythm of sweat and repetition. By the time the sun began its slow slide toward the western towers, Claire's shoulders ached and her palms were raw inside their wrappings. She was about to head to the mess hall when the stablemaster called out, asking for help with the old mare who had gone off her feet again. The mare was a gray, a gentle-hearted beast with a swayed back and a patient eye. Claire had taken to her in the first week, when she discovered that the stablemaster had named her for her color and little else. The horse had no family, no story, no one to speak for her. Claire understood that better than she cared to admit. She led the mare to the trough, let her drink slow and long, and stood with her hand reset peak like the warm curve of the gray neck. While the evening settled over the keep, the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the lilacs that grew along the western wall. "You and I are the same," she said quietly to the mare. "Both of us left behind." The mare flicked an ear but said nothing. Claire smiled a little and patted her shoulder. It was not a sad thing, she decided. It was just the truth. She was walking back across the yard, wiping her hands on her trousers, when she saw him, the patrolman from the night before, standing at the edge of the training ground with a scroll in his hand, speaking to Sergeant Holt in low tones. He was dressed plainly now in a soldier's tunic and a worn leather jerkin, but something about the way he held himself set him apart. He stood like a man who was used to being obeyed even when he was not giving orders. Claire slowed her steps, but she did not stop. She had no reason to stop. The patrolman had been polite enough, in his way, and she had told him what she thought of being watched. That was the whole of it. He looked up as she passed. His eyes met hers for the briefest moment, gray-green and unreadable. And then he looked away, back to the scroll in his hand. There was no recognition in his face, no sign that they had ever spoken. Good, she thought. That was good. She did not want to be remembered by a man who had watched her in the dark, but her hands were tightening on the strap of her sword and she could not say why. She was almost to the armory when she noticed the practice swords stacked loosely by the door, one of them with its grip wrapped in a strip of faded leather that had come loose at the end. She stopped, frowned, and picked it up. The leather was old, cracked in places, but it had been taffed carefully, with a patience she recognized. Someone had taken their time with this. She turned it over in her hands, testing the balance. The blade was serviceable, not fine, but the wrapping told a different story. Whoever had done this had cared for it the way a soldier cares for something that has kept them alive. She was so focused on the grip that she did not hear the footsteps until they were almost upon her. "That one is not yours." The voice was low and even, without heat. Claire looked up to find the patrolman standing a few paces away, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. He was watching her, and he was not smiling. She held the sword out toward him, hilt first. "The wrapping is coming loose at the end. It will need to be redone soon, or the grip will shift in a wet hand." He did not take the sword. He looked at it, then at her, and something flickered in his eyes. It was there and gone in an instant, like a fish breaking the surface of a still pond. "You know about grips," he said. It was not a question. "I know about the ones that have been cared for," she said. "This one has. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of lilacs and wood smoke. She had the strange feeling that she had said something important, though she could not think why. Then he stepped forward and took the sword from her hand. His fingers brushed hers just barely, and she felt the calluses on his palm, hard and worn from years of work. He looked at the loose leather, turned the sword over once, and then looked at her. "My father's," he said. He wrapped it himself. He said it the way a man says something he has not said in a long time, carefully, as if testing whether the words would hold. Claire did not answer. She simply nodded, and after a moment she said, "It is well done. He must have been a careful man." The patrolman looked at her for a long time. His jaw worked once, as if he were about to say something else, and then he turned away. "Good evening," he said, and walked off across the yard without looking back. Claire watched him go. She noticed, without meaning to, that he carried a sword at his hip, an old one with a worn leather grip that matched the practice sword in his hand. She noticed, too, that he walked like a man who was used to the weight of it. She did not think about him again, not on purpose anyway, but as she ate her supper alone in the corner of the mess hall, she found herself looking at the door, half expecting him to walk through it. He did not, and when she lay down in her bunk that night, staring at the dark ceiling, she found herself remembering the way his voice had softened when he said, "My father's," and the way his hand had held the sword as if it were something precious. She did not know his name. She did not know why he had looked at her that way, like she had surprised him, like she had said something he had not expected to hear. She only knew that she would know his face if she saw it again, even in the dark, especially in the dark. She turned over and closed her eyes, and the last thing she saw before sleep took her was the image of a man standing at the edge of a moonlit courtyard, watching her with gray-green eyes. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. The kitchens of Ashford Keep woke before the roosters did, and Claire learned that on her third morning in the castle, she reported for duty at the bell that marked the first hour after midnight, expecting to be handed a mop or a whetstone. But instead, the head cook, a broad woman named Bess, shoved a basket of turnips into her arms and pointed at a stool by the fire. "Peel," Bess said, "and mind you don't waste the skins, the pigs get those." Claire sat and peeled, her knife moving in quick, practiced strokes. The warmth of the hearth seeped into her bones, and for a while she let herself simply be warm and useful and unremarkable. The other kitchen girls came and went, chattering about a wedding in the lower town and a merchant who had tried to sell the castle a wagon-load of spoiled fish. Claire did not join the talk, but she listened, and the listening felt almost like belonging. She had just finished the last turnip when she heard it, a low, bitten-off grunt from the corridor outside the kitchen door. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to make a sound. Claire set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. "Bess, I'll be back in a moment. Suit yourself," Bess said, already reaching for the next basket. The corridor was dim, lit only by a single torch at the far end. Claire found him half-sitting, half-leaning against the wall, one leg stretched out stiffly in front of him, his face pale and beaded with sweat. It was Doran, the young soldier with the twisted ankle she had bandaged the day before. He had been told to stay off it for a week. He was clearly not one for following orders. "Claire," he said, and the way he said her name was half greeting, half apology. I thought if I walked it a bit, it might loosen up." She crouched in front of him without asking permission. "It's swollen again," she said, touching the bandage with light fingers. "Did you walk on it all night?" Doran winced. "I had guard duty, couldn't get out of it." "You could have asked someone to—" "Everyone's tired," he said, and there was a boyish stubbornness in his voice that reminded her of someone she did not want to think about. "I didn't want to be a burden." Claire felt something tighten in her chest. She knew that feeling, the small, fierce pride that made you grit your teeth and pretend you did not hurt, because asking for help felt like admitting you were not enough. She had worn that pride like armor for years. "Wait here," she said. "Don't move that leg." She went back into the kitchen, ignoring Bess's raised eyebrow, and ladled a bowl of the stew that had been simmering since midnight. She added a thick slice of bread and a spoon, wrapped the bread in a cloth so it would stay warm, and carried the bowl back out into the corridor. Doran stared at the bowl like she had handed him a piece of the sun. "You didn't have to eat," Claire said firmly. "And then I'm going to re-wrap that ankle properly, and you're going to sit here until the swelling goes down, understood?" He opened his mouth, closed it, and took the bowl. The first spoonful went down slowly, and something in his face softened. "This is the first hot thing I've had in 2 days," he said. "The mess hall runs out by the time my shift ends." Claire knelt and began to unwind the bandage. She did not look up, but she could feel the warmth of his gratitude in the air between them, and it was a good feeling, a quiet one. Neither of them saw the figure standing in the shadow of the storeroom door, watching with gray-green eyes. Nathaniel had not intended to come to the kitchens that morning. He had intended to review the Eastern Wall's rotation schedule and then retreat to his study, where the day's petitions were piling up like snowdrifts. But his feet had carried him past the training board, past the mess hall, and down the narrow corridor that led to the castle's heart, where the fires were always burning and the smell of bread hummed in the air like a promise. He had told himself it was a routine inspection. He had told himself he was checking on the morale of the lower staff. He had told himself a great many things, and none of them were true. He stopped in the shadow of the storeroom door and watched the young woman with the single dark braid kneel on the cold stone floor and rewrap the ankle of a soldier who was not her kin, not her friend, not her responsibility. She worked with the quiet, unhurried care of someone who had done this many times before, and she did not once look around to see if anyone was watching. The soldier, Doran, he remembered, the one from the training yard, ate his stew and watched her with an expression of wondering gratitude. "You're good at this," he said. "Where'd you learn?" "Northmoor," she said briefly. "It was a hard place. You learned to patch people up, or you lost them." Nathaniel felt the words settle somewhere in his chest. Northmoor. The northern fells, bleak and wind-scoured, a place that bred hard people with harder lives. He had ridden through it once, years ago, and he remembered the way the villagers had looked at his banner not with awe, but with a wariness that spoke of too many winters and too few promises kept. She finished the bandage and sat back on her heels. "Stay off it today, I mean it." "I'll try," Doran said, and there was a sheepish grin on his face that made him look even younger. "Try harder than you did yesterday." "Yes, ma'am." Claire stood and brushed the dust from her knees. She picked up the empty bowl and the breadcloth and turned toward the kitchen, and for just a moment her gaze fluttered toward the storeroom door. Nathaniel stepped back into the shadow before he could think about what he was doing. His heart was beating in a way that had nothing to do with the morning chill. She had not seen him. He was certain of that. And yet, for one brief instant, he had felt the weight of her attention. The sense that she was the kind of person who noticed things, who paid attention to the world around her even when she was tired and hungry, and working a job no one thanked her for. He waited until the kitchen door had swung shut behind her before he stepped out of the shadow. He stood in the corridor for a long moment looking at the closed door, and then he turned and walked back the way he had come. His steps were slower than they had been. His mind was not on the eastern wall or the petitions or the thousand small burdens of the crown. His mind was on a woman in a borrowed kitchen who had fed a hungry soldier and bandaged his ankle without once being asked, without once expecting anything in return. He had spent 8 nights watching her. He had told himself it was caution, prudence, the careful assessment of potential risk to the keep. But it was not caution, it was not prudence. It was curiosity, a kind of curiosity he had not felt in years, the kind that made him want to know not just what she did, but who she was. That evening, Nathaniel summoned his steward to his private study. The fire crackled low, and the shadows stretched long across the stone walls. He sat at his desk, turning a worn leather cord between his fingers. The same cord that bound the hilt of his father's old sword, the one that hung on the wall above the hearth. "Steward," he said without looking up. "The night patrol rotation. Is there a vacancy?" The steward blinked. "My lord, the night patrol is handled by the lower garrison. It is not—" "I know what it is," Nathaniel said quietly. "I am asking if there is a vacancy." The steward hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There is always a vacancy, my lord. Men rotate in and out. Would you like me to arrange for me to be added, under a different name? No titles, no ceremony." The steward's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. "My lord, the men would recognize you, your height, your bearing." "Then I shall have to stoop and slouch," Nathaniel said, and there was the ghost of something almost like humor in his voice. "See that it is done, starting tomorrow night." The steward bowed and left, and Nathaniel sat alone in the firelight, turning the leather cord over and over in his fingers. He thought about the way Claire had knelt on the cold stone floor without hesitation. He thought about the way she had said Northmoor, like it was a scar she had learned to carry. He thought about the way she had not looked for praise. He did not know what he was doing. He only knew that the thought of watching her from the shadows for another night felt wrong somehow, like stealing, like taking something she had not offered. He wanted her to see him. He wanted her to know his face, not as a king, not as a shadow, but as a man. He just did not know if he was brave enough to let her. The night patrol assembled in the stable yard as the last light bled from the sky. Claire arrived early as she always did, and found the other guardsmen leaning against the fence, talking in low voices about the new man. "From the northern border, they say," one of them muttered. "Must be a hard one. If they sent him down here." Claire did not join the talk. She simply tightened the strap on her sword belt and waited, letting the familiar weight of the blade settle against her hip. She had learned long ago that words were cheap. It was what a person did with their hands that mattered. Then she saw him. He came out of the shadows near the armory, a tall figure in a plain leather tunic and a dark cloak. His sword hung at his side, and he walked with the kind of quiet, unhurried step that spoke of a man who had learned to move through the world without asking permission. The torchlight caught his face for a moment, and Claire saw the scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone, pale against the weathered skin. She had never seen him before. He was not one of the regular garrison men. The patrol captain, a grizzled old soldier named Brodden, waved them over. "This is Aldrich," he said, jerking his thumb at the newcomer. "Just transferred down from the northern marches. He'll be walking the east wall with us tonight. Treat him well and learn what you can." Claire nodded. The man called Aldrich gave a short, formal bow to the group. But his eyes did not sweep over them the way new men usually did. Instead, they rested on her for a moment longer than the others, and she felt a strange prickle at the back of her neck. She dismissed it. She was a lowly guardsman from the Northmoor Fells. Men did not look at her twice, and she preferred it that way. The patrol set out along the east wall, the torches guttering in the night breeze. Claire fell into her usual position near the rear, scanning the shadows out of habit, listening to the rhythm of boots on packed earth. The new man, Aldrich, walked a few paces ahead of her. He carried himself like someone used to command, and that made her curious, but she said nothing. They had been walking for nearly an hour when she noticed it. Every time they passed a stretch, stuck in a wall where the mortar had crumbled, or a gate where the hinges sagged, he slowed. He did not stop, did not point, did not say a word. But his eyes marked each fault with a kind of quiet attention that she recognized, because it was the same way she looked at a broken tool or a cracked blade. He was a man who noticed things. She could work with that. The patrol stopped for a short rest at the North Watchtower, where a small brazier burned against the chill. Claire found a spot near the wall and sat down, pulling off her gloves to warm her hands over the flames. Aldrich settled a few feet away, saying nothing, staring at the fire with an expression she could not read. She studied him in the flickering light. He was broad across the shoulders, with hands that looked more accustomed to a sword than a plow. His dark hair was cropped short, and the scar on his cheek was not the neat, clean scar of a duel. It was ragged, the kind of wound that came from a close call, from steel that had nearly taken the eye with it. "You hold your sword wrong," she said. The words came out before she could stop them, and she winced. She had a habit of speaking her mind when she was tired, and she was tired tonight. Aldrich turned his head slowly, his gray-green eyes meeting hers. For a long moment, she thought she had offended him. Then the corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Wrong?" he repeated. "How so?" She hesitated, but he did not look angry, and something in his voice was almost curious. "Your grip," she said, sitting up a little straighter. "When you walked past me earlier, I saw how you hold the hilt. It's a dueling grip. Fine for the practice yard, but out here, on the wall, you want a firmer hold. Lower on the pommel, more control in a crowded space." He looked, you think, at his own hand as if seeing it for the first time. Then he looked back at her. "You watch people's hands," he said. It was not a question. "I watch people's hands," she agreed. "They tell the truth when mouths don't." Something shifted in his face at that. It was there and gone in an instant, like the shadow of a cloud crossing a field, but she caught it. She had spent her whole life reading the faces of people who did not want to be read. "You are right," he said quietly. "I was taught that grip for the yard." He paused. "It seems I have spent too much time in the yard." Claire was surprised. She had expected the new man to be prickly about criticism the way most soldiers were, but he had taken it with a grace that felt almost strange coming from a man his size. "Most men would have told me to mind my own business," she said. "Most men are fools," he said, and there was a dry, wry quality to the words that made her want to smile. She did smile, just a little, and looked back at the fire. The patrol resumed after the rest, and they walked the rest of the wall in a companionable silence. When they returned to the stable yard near midnight, Claire found herself reluctant to let the night end. It had been a long time since she had shared a quiet hour with someone who did not talk her ear off or try to prove something. She was about to head for the barracks when she remembered the leak. The stablemaster had been complaining about the east trough for weeks. The old wooden trough had cracked along its seam, and every time it was filled, a thin stream of water bled out onto the straw. Claire had reported it 3 times, and 3 times it had been ignored. She walked over to the stables, planning to take a look at it herself. She could not fix it tonight, but she could at least see how bad it had become. The trough was worse than she remembered. The crack had widened, and the straw beneath it was sodden. She crouched down, running her fingers along the damaged seam, and let out a low sigh. You look at that the way I look at a broken sword, a voice said behind her. She looked up. Aldrich was standing in the stable doorway, a lantern in his hand. He had taken off his cloak and the lamplight fell across his face in a way that made the old scar stand out starkly against his skin. I was going to fix it, she said a little defensively. You just have been waiting for someone to listen, he finished. I know the feeling. He set the lantern down on a crate and walked over to the trough, crouching beside her. His presence was large and quiet, and she found herself shifting aside to give him room without thinking. Have you got a chisel? He asked. Yes, she blinked. In the toolbox by the door. Fetch it. She fetched it, and the mallet, and a small piece of oak she had been saving for a handle repair. He took them without ceremony, examined the crack with the same quiet attention he had given the wall, and set to work. Claire knelt beside him, handing him tools as he needed them. Watching his hands, he worked with a patience that surprised her. He did not hurry. He did not curse. He simply fitted the oak patch into the seam, tapped it into place with the mallet, and sealed it with a strip of leather. There, he said at last, sitting back on his heels. That will hold. She stared at the required trough. It was a good repair, a clean repair, the kind of repair she would have made herself, if she had had the time. Why did you do that? She asked. He looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw something in his eyes that she could not name, a loneliness so old and so familiar that it looked like patience. Because it needed doing, he said, and no one else was going to do it. That hit her somewhere deep and unexpected. She looked away, pretending to examine the trough again. You are not like the other knights, she said. How do you know I am a knight? You wear a knight's sword. You walk like someone who has never had to look over his shoulder. She paused. But you are not like them. They would have walked past this trough without a second glance. He was quiet for a long moment. The lantern flickered between them, casting long shadows across the straw. I have spent too long walking past things without a second glance, he said at last. I am trying to do better? Claire did not know what to say to that. It was a strange confession coming from a man she had only met a few hours ago, but it did not feel strange. It felt like something she had been waiting to hear all her life. She stood up, brushing the straw from her knees, and looked at him. You are welcome back tomorrow night, Aldrich, she said, if you want to walk the wall again. He looked up at her. The lantern light caught his face, and she saw the scar on his cheek in full clarity for the first time. It ran from his temple to his cheekbone, a thin white line against the weathered skin. It was the kind of scar that told a story, and she wondered what that story was. I will be here, he said. She nodded and turned and walked back toward the barracks, but she stopped at the stable door and looked back over her shoulder. He was still kneeling by the trough, his hand resting on the repaired seam. He was not looking at it, he was looking at her. The moonlight fell across the courtyard between them, and in that moment, Claire felt something shift in her chest. She did not know what it was, she did not know what to call it. She only knew that she would be back at the stable yard tomorrow night, and that the thought did not trouble her at all. She walked on into the darkness, and behind her the lantern burned on in the stable, and the man called Aldrich stayed where he was for a long time, looking at the place where she had stood. The stable yard was quiet when Claire arrived, the last light of dusk bleeding into a sky the color of old iron. She had come early, a habit born of a lifetime of being told she was not enough, of learning to arrive before anyone could question why she was there at all. He was already waiting. Aldrich stood by the trough he had repaired, his back to her, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something far off. The lantern beside him had been lit, and its glow caught the edge of his jaw, the line of his shoulder, the way his hand rested on the pommel of his sword, as if it were the only familiar thing in the world. You are early, he said without turning. So are you, she replied. He turned then, and there was something in his face that she could not name. Not quite a smile, but the absence of armor. A small thing, but she noticed it. They walked the perimeter in silence for the first hour, the familiar rhythm of boots on packed earth and the distant call of night birds filling the space between them. It was a comfortable silence, she realized, the kind that did not demand to be filled. It was near the old well, where the wall curved and the shadows poured deepest, that it happened. A loose stone turned under her boot. She stumbled, reached out to steady herself, and her hand caught the hilt of his sword. Her fingers brushed the leather binding. It was old, that leather faded from years of grip, worn smooth in places, the color bleached to a pale gray-brown like river stones. And it was wrapped with a care that spoke of habit, of hands that had done this same motion 1,000 times without thinking. She pulled her hand back quickly. "Forgive me. I did not mean—" He had gone still. Not the stillness of a man startled, but the stillness of a man who has learned to freeze before the world can see what he feels. His hand had come up, half reaching toward the hilt, then stopped in midair. He did not look at her. He looked at the sword, and his face was unreadable. "I am sorry," she said again, more quietly this time. "I should have watched my footing." He did not answer. The silence stretched, and she felt the weight of it press against her chest. She had seen men guard their weapons before. Every soldier did. But this was different. This was not the guarding of steel against rust or theft. This was the guarding of something that had once been held close and had been held at arm's length ever since. She did not know why she said it. The words came out before she could weigh them, soft and certain, like a stone dropping into still water. "You take good care of it." He looked at her then. "That blade," she said, nodding toward the sword. "You take good care of it. The leather is old, but it is clean. The pommel is worn, but it is polished. You treat it like it matters." He said nothing, but something shifted in his face. A crack, fine as a hairline in old pottery, running through the mask he wore. "It was not always mine," he said at last, and his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. "It belonged to someone who mattered. A long time ago." She waited. She did not press. She had learned long ago that some doors open only when you stop knocking and simply sit on the step and wait. She would have wanted it used, not mourned over, he said, and there was a roughness in his throat that he could not quite hide. "But I find I cannot let it go, so I keep it clean, I keep it sharp. I suppose I keep it alive." Claire felt something ache in her chest, a place she had not known was tender until that moment. "That is not mourning," she said quietly. "That is love. You are keeping it alive because you loved her, and love does not stop when the person is gone. It just changes shape." He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light caught the edge of his jaw, and she saw his throat move as he swallowed. "How do you know that?" he asked. She almost lied. The word "I do not know" was on her tongue, ready and familiar. But something in his face, that crack in the armor, made her stop. "Because I have someone I keep alive that way," she said. "Not a sword, a memory, a small one. The way my brother used to laugh when I told him a bad joke. I keep it. I polish it. I do not let it fade." His breath caught, a small sound, barely audible, but she heard it. "What was his name?" he asked. "Thomas," she said, and the word came out steadier than she had expected. "He was 4 years younger than me. He thought I hung the moon." Was. She nodded, and let the silence answer for her. The night pressed in around them, but it did not feel cold. It felt like the kind of quiet that holds its breath, waiting for something to be said or not said. They walked on, and the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the easy quiet of two people sharing a patrol. It was something else, something that hummed with unspoken things like the air before a storm. It was past the racks, where the path narrowed and the hedge grew thick, that she saw it properly for the first time. He had turned to check the far gate, and the lantern light fell full across his face. She had seen the scar before, of course. She had noted it on the first night, a pale line running from his temple to his cheekbone, old and faded but still visible in certain lights. But she had never really looked at it. Now, in the unguarded moment when he thought she was watching the gate, she saw the way it pulled at the corner of his eye, the way it must have ached in cold weather, the way it told a story she did not know. He caught her looking. "It is old," he said, and there was a tiredness in his voice that had not been there before. "A souvenir from a fight I would rather forget." She did not look away. She did not pretend she had not been staring. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He considered the question longer than she expected. "Sometimes. When the weather turns. When I am tired. When I remember." She nodded, and did not ask more. She had learned that some wounds are not for telling, only for carrying, and that the kindest thing you can do for a person carrying a wound is to walk beside them without demanding to see it. They finished the patrol in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of two people who have shown each other a small true thing and are learning to trust that it will be held gently. At the stable-yard, where the lantern still burned, he stopped. "Claire," he said, and she turned. "I have not told anyone about the sword," he said. "Not in years. I do not know why I told you." She met his eyes. "Because I asked the right question. Or maybe because you were ready to answer it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, he said, "Maybe both?" She smiled. "A small thing but real. Then I am glad I stumbled." He almost laughed. She saw it in the corner of his mouth, the way it twitched, the way his eyes warmed. It was not a laugh, not quite, but it was the closest thing she had seen from him, and it felt like a gift. "I will be here tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "I will be too." She turned and walked toward the barracks, and this time she did not look back. She did not need to. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that he would still be standing there in the lantern light, and that he would be looking at the place where she had stood. The ache in her chest had not gone away, but it had changed shape. It felt, she thought, like the beginning of something. The roomer arrived at breakfast, carried on the steam of weak ale and the scrape of wooden bowls. Claire heard it before she saw it, a cluster of soldiers at the long table, their heads bent together like conspirators, and then the word, "unlucky," spoken just loud enough to carry. She kept her eyes on her bread, tearing it into pieces she had no appetite for. "That's her," someone said, not bothering to lower their voice. "The one from the Fells. They say her whole family's gone, father, mother, brother, all dead. She's the only one left." "Bad blood, then?" "Bad luck, more like. You don't survive a thing like that without dragging something dark behind you." Claire set down the bread. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She had learned over the years to make her hands do what her heart could not. She stood, picked up her bowl, and walked to the wash barrel without looking at anyone. The whispers followed her like a trail of dry leaves rustling at her heels. Marin was in the corridor when she came out, a basket of cinnamons balanced on her hip. The older woman's eyes swept over Claire's face once, quick and knowing, and she said nothing about the whispers. Instead, she said, "You're on stable duty this morning." The bay mare threw a shoe. Claire nodded. "I'll see to it. The farrier's already there, you just need to hold her head and talk to her. She gets nervous with men." Claire almost smiled. "I can do that." Marin shifted the basket and added in the same flat tone, "There's a fresh oat cake in the kitchen, wrapped in cloth. It's for the mare. But if it happens to go missing on the way, I won't ask questions." It was such a small kindness, so quietly offered, that Claire felt her throat tighten. She blinked and looked away. "The mare will be grateful." "See that she is," Marin said, and walked on. The stable was warm and dim, smelling of hay and leather and horses. The bay mare, a gentle creature with a white star on her forehead, stood patiently while the farrier worked at her hoof. Claire stroked the mare's neck and murmured, "Nonsense," the way she did with the old gelding in the far stall. "Easy," she said. "Easy, girl. It's just a new shoe. You'll be running the meadow again by sundown." The mare snuffled against her shoulder, and for a little while Claire let herself pretend that the day was ordinary. But the whispers were not confined to the breakfast hall. They followed her to the armory, where the quartermaster handed her a bundle of practice blades without meeting her eyes. They followed her to the training yard, where the other recruits stepped back from the weapons rack when she approached, as if she might taint the steel by touching it. By midday, she understood the shape of it. The rumor had not just spread. It had been planted, watered, and coaxed into bloom. Someone had made a point of telling the story in a way that made it sound like a warning. She did not know who, she only knew that the eyes on her had changed, and that the change had come overnight. At the evening meal she found her usual seat at the end of the bench taken by a soldier she did not know. He glanced at her, then at the empty space beside him and deliberately spread his elbows wider. Claire stood there for a moment, holding her bowl, and felt the weight of the room's attention press down on her shoulders. She could have pushed past him, she was a trained swordwoman. She could have made a point without raising her voice. But she was tired, and she had learned long ago that fighting small battles only cost her strength she would need for the larger ones. She turned and walked to the far end of the hall where the benches were mostly empty, and ate her meal alone. The bread was dry, the stew was thin. She ate it anyway, because she had learned that too, to take what was given and to ask for nothing more. It was late when she finally let herself go to the stable. The old gelding, a gray with a swayed back and kind eyes, was the only creature she trusted not to judge her. He had been a war horse once, they said, before age had retired him to carrying sacks of grain and the occasional child on his back. She sat on an overturned bucket beside his stall, her back against the rough wood, and let out a long breath. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that if I worked hard enough and kept my head down and did everything right, they would stop noticing me." The gelding flicked an ear. "They don't stop," she said. "They never stop. They just find something new to whisper about." She leaned her head against the stall door. The wood smelled of hay and old sweat and the covey, think warmth of the animal's breath. "Thomas used to say I worried too much," she murmured. "He said the best way to deal with a bully was to ignore him until he got bored. He was 9 years old. He thought everything was that simple." Her voice cracked, just a little on the name. She pressed her palm against her mouth and waited for the feeling to pass. "He was wrong, of course," she said after a moment. "Bullies don't get bored, they get bolder. But I miss him anyway. I miss him every day." The gelding breathed out a long, soft sound, and she took it for comfort. She sat there for a long time, until the candle in the lantern burned low and the shadows stretched long across the stable floor. She did not see the figure in the doorway. She did not hear the soft scuff of boots on straw, or the way the figure paused and stepped back and stood in the dark without moving. Nathaniel had come to check on the bay mare, or so he had told himself. In truth, he had been looking for her since the midday meal, when he had seen her walk to the far end of the hall with her bowl in her hands and her back straight as a blade. He had seen the way the others had looked at her. He had seen the empty bench beside her, the way the space around her had grown wider and colder. He had not intervened. He could not. Not as Aldrich. Not without drawing questions he was not ready to answer. But he had stood in the doorway of the stable for a long time, listening to her speak to the old horse, and he had heard the crap in her voice when she said her brother's name. He waited until she had gone, until the stable was dark and quiet before he moved. The next morning, Claire woke to find a bundle at the foot of her bunk. She sat up, blinking, and unfolded the cloth. It was her old sword sheath, the one she had thought beyond repair, the one she had been meaning to replace. The leather had been oiled and stitched, the brass fittings polished until they caught the light. A new strap had been fitted, worked in a careful pattern she did not recognize. She ran her fingers over the stitching, and something in her chest loosened, just a little. She did not know who had left it. She did not know why, but she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that she had not been as alone as she had felt. The rumor did not disappear that day, or the next, but something shifted in the castle's rhythm, a small adjustment that no one noticed at first. The quartermaster, who had refused to meet her eyes, was reassigned to the northern granary, a transfer announced as a routine adjustment of duties. A young soldier who had repeated the rumor too loudly in the mess hall found himself assigned to latrine duty for a fortnight, under the direct supervision of Marin, who made him scrub the stones until they gleamed. No one connected these events to Claire. No one thought to look that high. But Marin, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea in her hand, watched the young soldier scrub and smiled into her cup. "Young people," she said to no one in particular, "never see what's right in front of their noses." By the end of the second day, the whispers had quieted, not stopped, not entirely, but softened, as if the air had been let out of them. Claire did not know why. She only knew that the bench at the end of the hall was empty again, and that the soldier who had spread his elbows wide now found somewhere else to sit. She ate her meal in peace, and she did not look for the person who had left the sheath. She did not look for him, because she was afraid that if she found him, she, like Reginald, can have to explain the way her hand shook when she held it. But that night, as she walked past the stable, she paused. The lantern was lit. The old gelding's head was up, ears pricked toward the door. Someone had been there. Someone had left a fresh bucket of water in the stall and a few carrots on the shelf. She stood in the doorway looking at the small, quiet offerings and felt the ache in her chest change shape again. It was the same ache she had felt in the Moonlit Courtyard, when the man with the gray-green eyes had told her that his sword belonged to someone he could not let go of. It was the ache of being seen. She did not know his name. She did not know why he chose to leave these things where she would find them, or what he hoped they would say. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would find him tomorrow in the lantern light, and that he would still be looking at her the way he had looked at her before, as if she were not a rumor, not a shadow, not a bad luck story whispered over a weak ale, as if she were someone worth waiting for. She turned away from the stable and walked back toward the barracks, and the ache in her chest burned bright and warm, like a candle in a window, like a promise she had not yet learned to name. The fever came on her like a thief in the night. Claire woke before dawn with her throat raw and her bones aching as if she had spent the whole night fighting. She lay still for a long moment, staring at the wooden beams above her bunk, and tried to convince herself that it was only the damp air of late spring, that she had slept badly, that a drink of water would set her right. But when she sat up, the room tilted gently, and she knew. She pressed the back of her hand to her forehead. Warm. Too warm. Shagat. Thought about staying in bed. She thought about it the way a soldier thinks about a wound she cannot afford to name, and then she pushed the blanket aside and reached for her boots. By the time the morning bell rang, she was standing in formation with the others, her spine straight and her jaw set, and if her eyes were a little too bright and her cheeks a little too flushed, no one bothered to look close enough to notice. The day passed in a blur of small duties. She mucked stalls, hauled water, helped the farrier hold a nervous gelding steady while he worked. Each task cost her more than it should have. By my afternoon she was trembling with a chill that had nothing to do with the cool wind off the moors, and she had to grip the edge of the trough to keep her hands from shaking. She did not report to the infirmary. She did not report to anyone. She had learned long ago that no one came for a low-born soldier with a fever, and that complaining only earned you a reputation for weakness. So she worked, and she swallowed the bitterness in her throat, and she told herself she was fine. She was not fine. It was Marin who noticed, because Marin noticed everything. The old housekeeper found her in the kitchen that evening, slumped on a stool with a half-peeled turnip in her lap, her head nodding toward her chest. Marin took one look at her and clicked her tongue. "You," she said, pointing a ladle at Claire's chest, "are the color of old porridge, and you are going straight to your bunk." "I have night patrol," Claire mumbled. "You have nothing of the sort." Marin set the ladle down and came closer, pressing the back of her weathered hand to Claire's forehead. She made a sound low in her throat. "You are burning up, child. You will be no good to anyone if you collapse in a daze. The patrol will survive one night without you." Marin's voice softened, just a fraction. "And you will survive if you let yourself rest for once." Claire wanted to argue. The words were already forming on her tongue. The old reflex of pushing through, of proving she was not weak, of never asking for anything. But the room was swaying gently, and Marin's hand was cool against her skin, and she was so tired. "Fine," she whispered, "just tonight." Marin nodded and shooed her out of the kitchen with a firm hand between her shoulder blades. Claire made it to her bunk, lay down without undressing, and was asleep before her head touched the pillow. She did not hear the door open again some time later. She did not see the tall figure that stood in the doorway for a long moment silhouetted against the lantern light, before setting a small clay pot and a folded cloth on the stool beside her bed. She did not see the way his gray-green eyes lingered on her face, or the way his jaw tightened when she shivered in her sleep. She simply slept, and dreamed of the moonlit courtyard, and of a voice she could not quite place. When she woke, it was deep night, and the fever had broken. She lay still for a long moment, breathing in the cool air, aware of the dampness of her shift and the weakness in her limbs. Her head was clearer now, the sharp edge of the fever dulled to a manageable ache. She pushed herself up on one elbow, reaching for the cup of water she kept by her bed, and her hand brushed against something that had not been there before, a small clay pot. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was sealed with wax, and when she cracked it open, the smell of honey and willow bark rose up to meet her. Her fingers trembled as she set it down and reached for the book into left cloth beside it. It was a clean bandage, soft and worn at the edges, the kind someone had used many times and washed by hand. And beneath it, a small loaf of brown bread still faintly warm. Claire stared at the things on her stool for a long time. Her throat tightened. She did not know who had left them. She did not know why they had come, or how they had known she was sick, or what they hoped she would do with a pot of honeyed willow bark and a loaf of bread still warm from an oven. But she knew, with a certainty that made her chest ache, that it was the same hand that had left the herbs and the carrots, the same hand that had stitched her old sword sheath with careful, steady thread. She ate the bread slowly, savoring each bite. She did not know who to thank. She did not even know if she would ever meet them face to face. But she found herself whispering into the dark, her voice rough with sleep and gratitude. "Thank you." The words hung in the air, unanswered. She slept again, and this time she did not dream of the courtyard. She dreamed of a hearth fire, and of a door that opened onto warm light, and of someone waiting on the other side. She did not see his face, but she woke, feeling less alone than she had in years. The next evening, she was back on patrol. She had insisted on it, despite Marin's protests and the lingering weakness in her legs. The fever had broken, she told herself. She was fine. She was always fine. The patrol was quiet, the night cool and clear. She walked the eastern wall with the others, her torch held low, her eyes scanning the shadows out of habit. It was good to be moving again, good to feel the cool air on her face and the solid ground beneath her boots. She was rounding the corner near the old watchtower when she saw him. He was standing in the lantern light, his back to her, one hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He wore the plain leather armor of a patrol captain, and his dark hair was ruffled by the wind. He had not heard her approach. She stopped, a few paces behind him, and for a moment she simply looked at him. She had seen him before, of course. He had been on the patrol with her for weeks now, a quiet, capable man who kept to himself and did his duty without complaint. She had noted the way he handled his sword, the easy confidence of his stance. She had noted, too, the gray-green eyes that sometimes lingered on her when he thought she was not looking. But she had never really looked at him before, not like this. She cleared her throat. "Captain." He turned, and for a moment his expression softened into something almost like warmth before settling back into its usual careful neutrality. "Soldier, you should be resting." "I'm fine," she said, the words automatic. He said nothing, but his gaze swept over her face, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through the lie. She shifted her weight, looking away. "The patrol's quiet tonight," she said to fill the silence. "It is." He fell into step beside her, and they walked the wall together, their boots crunching in unison on the gravel. "How are you feeling?" She blinked, surprised. "I told you. I'm fine." "I asked how you were feeling," he said, his voice low. "Not whether you were fine." The words caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to give the usual answer, the one she always gave, the one that kept people at a safe distance. But something in his tone, something in the way he was looking at her, made the words stick in her throat. "I'm better," she said at last. And it was the truth. "Someone left me mama, venison, and bread. I don't know who." He made a small sound, neither agreement nor denial. They walked in silence for a few more paces. "It was good bread," she added, watching him from the corner of her eye. "Still warm. Whoever it was, they went to some trouble. Maybe they thought you were worth the trouble." His voice was even, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Her step faltered. She caught herself, steadying her stride, and was grateful that the darkness hid the sudden heat in her cheeks. "That's a strange thing to say," she managed. "Is it?" He glanced at her, and in the lantern light his gray-green eyes were unreadable. "I've found that most things worth doing are a little strange." They reached the end of the wall, where a narrow stair led down to the courtyard. He stopped, and she stopped with him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Get some rest," he said at last. "The fever may be gone, but the body takes time to recover." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she did not need anyone's concern, that she had been taking care of herself for years, that she did not know why he, of all people, seemed to see through every wall she built, but the words would not come. "Thank you," she said instead, and she was not sure if she meant it for the concern, or for the patrol, or for something else entirely. He nodded, and turned, and walked back along the wall, disappearing into the shadows. Claire stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, watching the place where he had vanished. The ache in her chest was back, but it was not the familiar ache of loneliness. It was something warmer, something she did not have a name for. She walked back to the barracks slowly, her steps light, and when she reached her bunk, she found a small clay cup on the stool, beside it still warm. It was filled with broth, rich and savory, the kind that took hours to make. She sat down on the edge of the bunk, cradling the cup in both hands, and let the warmth seep into her fingers. She did not know who had left it. She did not know why they kept leaving things, or what they hoped she would understand. But she drank every last drop, and when she lay down to sleep, she did not feel alone. In the shadows beyond the barracks window, a tall figure watched for a moment longer, then turned and walked away into the night. The afternoon sun hung low over the practice yard, casting long shadows across the packed earth. Claire moved through the drill with mechanical precision, her blade cutting the air in even, unhurried arcs. The fever had left her 2 days ago, and with it had gone the last of that strange, nameless warmth she had carried since the wall. She still found herself glancing toward the barracks door when she thought no one was watching. The broth had stopped appearing after she returned to duty. The medicine, the bread, the repaired scabbard, all of it had ceased, as suddenly as it had begun. She told herself it did not matter. She had never known who left those things, and she had never asked. But her eyes kept searching, and her chest kept tightening around a question she did not know how to voice. She finished the drill and lowered her blade, breathing hard. Around her, the other soldiers were breaking into small groups, laughing and trading insults as they headed for the water barrels. No one called her name. No one waved her over. She had grown used to that, too. She was wiping down her sword when she heard the voice. Well, well, if it isn't the Northmoor girl. Claire looked up. A broad-shouldered man in a worn leather jerkin, stepping to the edge of the practice yard, arms crossed, a crooked smile on his face. She did not recognize him at first, and then the shape of his jaw, the way he held his weight on his heels, clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. She knew him. She had known him years ago, in another life, in a cold garrison at the edge of the fells. "Garrick," she said flatly. "Garrick," he repeated, nodding as if pleased she remembered. "Been a long time, Claire. Heard you'd come south. Heard you were working the walls here like some common foot soldier." He let his gaze travel over her, slow and deliberate. "Didn't believe it at first. Thought the Northmoor name still meant something." Claire said nothing. She kept her grip loose on the sword, her face still. "Ah, but I forget," Garrick went on, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "The Northmoor name don't mean much these days, does it? Not since your father got himself killed and your mother followed him. Not since that little brother of yours." He stopped, tilting his head. "What was his name? Tomas, wasn't it? Little Tomas, the one you were always dragging around after you." The air left Claire's lungs in a single, sharp breath. Her fingers tightened on the sword hilt until the leather creaked. "That's right," Garrick said, nodding slowly. "Tomas. Heard he didn't make it. Heard you were there. Heard you couldn't." "Enough!" The word came out of her before she could stop it, low and rough, like a blade being dragged across stone. Garrick's smile widened. "Touched a nerve, did I? Must be true then. All those stories about the Northmoor girl, the one what couldn't save her own kin. No wonder they shipped you down here. No wonder nobody wants you around." Claire stood very still. The voices of the other soldiers had faded into a distant hum. She could feel their eyes on her, dozens of them, curious and uncomfortable and waiting. She could feel the old scar on her left brow prickling, as if it remembered the moment it was made. She opened her mouth. She did not know what she was going to say, some sharp retort, some scrap of pride to throw back at him. But before the words could come, a shadow fell across the space between them, and a quiet voice spoke from behind her shoulder. "Garrick of the Eastgate Garrison." It was not a question. Garrick's smile faltered. He looked past Claire, and his face went carefully blank. Claire turned. A tall figure stood a few paces behind her, still as stone, one hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The pale afternoon light caught the scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone, and his gray-green eyes were fixed on Garrick with a stillness that made the air feel thinner. "Aldrich," Claire said, surprised. She had not seen him approach. She had not seen him at all since the night on the wall. He did not look at her. His gaze stayed on Garrick. "You were at the Northmoor Fells," he said, 7 years ago. "I remember the garrison records." Garrick's jaw tightened. "What of it?" Claire of Northmoor was listed as a ward of the garrison after her father's death. Her brother's name was on the rolls, too. Nathaniel's voice was calm, unhurried like a man reading from a ledger. The records note that the boy died of a fever, not of anything his sister did or failed to do. A murmur rippled through the watching soldiers. Garrick's face reddened. "I didn't say she killed him," he muttered. "I only said—" "You said enough." Nathaniel stepped forward, one slow, deliberate stride. "You served in the same garrison. You knew the girl was a child then, and you knew her brother was a child too. Whatever you think you remember, whatever stories you've been carrying all these years, you will not repeat them here." Garrick held his ground for a moment, his jaw working. Then he looked away, spat on the ground, and turned on his heel. "Not worth the trouble," he muttered, and walked off toward the barracks, the small crowd parting to let him through. The yard fell quiet. Claire stood frozen, her sword still in her hand, her breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls. She could feel the eyes of the other soldiers on her, and she could not bear them. She turned and walked, fast, toward the gate at the far end of the yard, not looking back. She did not stop until she reached the old practice courtyard behind the armory, the one nobody used anymore. The stone walls were cracked and overgrown with ivy. The moon was already rising, pale and thin in the fading blue sky. She set her sword down on the low stone wall. Then she sat on the edge of it, her hands folded in her lap, and stared at the ground. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, not trying to hide. "Aldrich," she said without turning. "You should not have done that." He stopped a few paces away. She could feel his presence behind her, large and quiet like a tree casting shade. "Done what?" he asked. "Spoken for me." Her voice came out rough, scraped raw. "Now they will all think I am someone who needs a man to fight her battles." There was a long pause. Then she heard him move, and he sat down on the wall beside her, leaving a careful space between them. "I did not fight your battle," he said. "I corrected a false record. There is a difference." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "You did not have to." "No," he agreed. "I did not have to. But I did." She finally turned to look at him. His face was half in shadow, the scar on his cheek catching the last of the daylight. He was not looking at her. He was looking out across the courtyard at the ivy and the cracked stones, as if he were giving her the privacy to say whatever she needed to say. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She had not noticed until now. "He was 9, she said quietly. "Thomas. He was 9 years old, and he had a laugh like—" She stopped, swallowed. "He had a laugh that made you forget the war. He used to follow me everywhere. I used to complain about it. I told him he was too young to trail after me, that he should stay with the other children, that I needed room to practice my forms." She heard herself make a small, broken sound. "The night it happened, he was not supposed to be there. There was a raid. The garrison was overrun. I found him in the chaos. He had followed me, the way he always did, and I—" She pressed her hand to her left brow, where the old scar lay faded and white. "A piece of the gate came down. I pushed him out of the way. I thought I had gotten there in time." The silence stretched between them, long and heavy. "He died 3 days later," she said. "Of the fever. The wounds were not what killed him. It was the fever that took him. The same fever that was always taking children in the fells." Her voice cracked. "I could not save him. I was right there, and I could not save him. And I have carried that with me every single day since." She stopped. Her throat was too tight to speak. Beside her, Nathaniel was very still. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, careful, like a man walking across thin ice. "You were a child too," he said. "You were 14. You had no sword that could stop a fever. And the one could have?" "I know that," she said, and the words came out bitter. "I have told myself that 100 times, 1,000. It does not change the fact that he is gone, and I am here, and everyone in the fells remembers the Northmoor girl who could not save her little brother." She heard him shift beside her, then slowly she felt the warmth of his hand on the stone between them. Not touching her, just resting there, an offering she could take or leave. "You saved him from the gate," he said. "You pushed him out of the way of the falling wood. The scar on your brow. That is where it happened, is it not?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then you did save him," he said quietly. "You saved him from the moment that would have killed him then and there. You gave him 3 more days. 3 days of his laugh, his voice, his small hand in yours. That is not nothing, Claire, that is not nothing." She stared at his hand on the stone, The word sat in her chest, heavy and warm, like bread fresh from the oven. "You do not know that," she whispered. "You do not know what those 3 days were like." "No," he said, "I do not. But I know what it is to carry a weight like that, to wonder if you could have done more, been faster, been stronger. To wake up in the dark and go over it again and again, looking for the moment you might have changed everything." She looked up at him. His face was turned away, toward the rising moon, and in the pale light she saw his jaw tighten, once, around something he did not say. She did not press. She did not ask. She simply sat there, on the cracked stone wall in the quiet courtyard, with the tall stranger beside her, and the moon climbing overhead. After a long while, she let out a breath she had been holding for years. "I am tired," she said, shaded, and it was not about her body. "I know," he said. They sat in silence as the stars came out one by one, and the night wrapped around them like a blanket. The second evening after the courtyard, Claire found him at the old watchtower on the outer wall, the place where the keep's oldest stones met the sky. He was standing with his back to her, looking out over the valley, and she noticed that he had not bothered to hide himself. He was simply there, as if he had known she would come. "You are not a guard," she said, stopping a few paces behind him. "I have been thinking about it all day. The way you spoke to Garrick, the things you knew about the Northmoor records. No ordinary soldier talks like that." He turned, and in the fading light she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. It was not the guarded stillness she had grown used to. It was the look of a man who had decided to stop pretending. "My name is not Aldrich," he said quietly. "It is Nathaniel, Nathaniel of House Thornwood." The words hung in the air between them. She heard them and she understood them, and for a long moment she could not move. The Alpha King, the man who ruled Eldermere with a will of iron, the man whose name was spoken in whispers and never in his presence. She had taught him how to sharpen a blade. She had shown him the proper way to wrap a horse's leg. She had sat beside him on a broken stone wall and told him about her brother. "Why?" she managed, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "Why would you pretend to be someone else? Why would you bother with a low-ranking soldier from the Northmoor Fells?" He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if he did not trust himself to come closer. "Do you remember a soldier named Elias? Fair hair, a scar on his left hand. He served in the Northmoor campaign 2 years ago." She frowned, searching her memory. Then something clicked into place. "The one who took a spear to the shoulder? I bound the wound with strips of my own tunic because there was no linen left." "Yes," he said, "that is the one. He is my personal guard. He has served me since we were boys, and when he came home from that campaign, he spoke of a young woman in the Northmoor Fells who saved his arm, maybe his life, and who asked for nothing in return. She would not even tell him her name." Claire shook her head slowly. "I did not do anything that anyone else would not have done." "You did," he said. "You did, and it stayed with me. I came to Ashford Keep to inspect the defenses, but I also came because I wanted to see the woman Elias could not stop talking about. I watched you for 7 nights, and on the 7th night I made a decision." "What decision?" "I stopped watching," he said, "and started walking toward you. The only way I knew how was to become someone you would not be afraid of. So I became Aldrich." She stood very still. The wind moved through the crenellations of the old wall, and she felt the weight of everything he had just said pressing against her chest. 7 nights. He had watched her for 7 nights, and then he had chosen to step out of the shadows and into her life as someone she could talk to. "You knew about my brother," she said slowly. "In the courtyard, when I told you about Tamaz. You already knew, did you not?" "Yes," he said. "I know your full record. I know about your father, and about what happened to your family. I know why you were sent here, and I know the lie that followed you." She felt a flash of something hot and sharp in her chest. "Then why did you let me tell you? Why did you sit there and let me pour out my heart to you when you already knew everything?" "Because it was not the same," he said, and his voice was rough now, stripped of its kingly calm. "Reading a record tells me what happened. Hearing you say it, seeing your hands tremble, watching you hold yourself together while you spoke of your brother. That is not the same, Claire. That is you trusting me with something you have carried alone for years. I would not have stolen that from you, even for a moment." She opened her mouth, but no words came. The anger she had felt was already fading, replaced by something she did not have a name for. He had not come to her as a king. He had come as a stranger, and he had earned her trust the only way it could be earned. By sitting in the dark with her, by not running from her pain, by staying until the stars came out. "Why do you carry that sword?" she asked suddenly, nodding to the blade at his hip. "I have seen you handle it like it is the most precious thing you own, but the leather on the grip is worn almost through, and you have never once drawn it in my presence." He looked down at the sword, and for a long moment he did not speak. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "It belonged to my wife," he said. "She died 8 years ago, in the winter. She was a swordswoman, the finest I have ever known. She taught me that a blade is not for show and that a grip worn thin by use is worth more than a jeweled hilt that has never known a hand." Claire felt her breath catch. She had never heard him speak of a wife. No one in the keep spoke of it. Not that she had heard. She looked at the sword again, and she understood now why he handled it with such care. Why he never drew it except to clean it. Why the leather was sphinx then smooth in the exact shape of his hand. "You have protected it well," she said softly. "It shows. A weapon that is loved, you can tell. It has been held by someone who knows what it is worth." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something break open, quietly, like ice giving way in a spring thaw. "No one has ever said that to me," he said. "Not in 8 years. Everyone sees the sword and thinks of the king who carries it. You are the only one who saw that it was loved." They stood there in the fading light, the old wall stretching away on either side, the valley darkening below them. The distance between them had become very small, and neither of them had moved to close it, but neither of them had moved away. "There is something else you should know," he said. "The rumor about you, the one that followed you from the Northmoor Fells. It was not born from anything you did. It was started by a man who feared your father's name. Your father was a good man, Claire, a loyal one. He stood against the old lord's corruption, and he paid for it with everything he had. When he died, the old lord made sure the story spread that your family was cursed. He could not let the truth of what your father had done take root." She had known pieces of this. She had always suspected there was more to the story than she had been told, but to hear it spoken plainly, by a man who had no reason to lie to her, made something in her chest loosen and crack at the same time. "My father's name," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, "is still honored in the Northmoor Fells," he said firmly. "I have seen the records myself. I have spoken to the old soldiers who served with him. They speak of him with respect, Claire. They speak of him the way I would want my own name spoken." She turned, think away from him, pressing her hand against her mouth, and the tears came. They came the way they had come in the courtyard, hot and sudden. But this time, they were not only grief. They were relief. They were the sound of a weight she had carried for years, finally being set down by someone else's hands. He did not move toward her. He did not reach for her. He simply stood there, a few paces away, giving her the space to feel what she needed to feel. And when her shoulders stopped shaking, she turned back to face him. "How many nights did you watch me?" she asked, her voice raw. 7, he said. "And from the 7th night on, I have not been able to look away. Not because I was watching a soldier I needed to assess, because I was watching a woman I wanted to know." She took a step toward him, then another, and then she was standing close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way the scar on his cheek caught the last of the light. "I have been alone for a long time," she said. "I thought I was used to it. I told myself I did not need anyone to see me, that I could go through my life being nobody, being nothing, as long as I did my work and kept my head down. But you saw me. You saw me, and you did not look away." "I could not," he said. "I tried. For 7 nights I told myself I would watch one more time and then move on, that you were just a soldier who had done a good deed and that was the end of it. But the more I watched, the more I saw. The way you talked to the horses, the way you fixed that soldier's harness without being asked, the way you bite your lip when you are concentrating on your sword forms, the way you say, 'I am fine,' when you are anything but." A sound came out of her, something between a laugh and a sob. "You noticed that?" "I know everything about you," he said simply. I have not been able to stop noticing since the first night. She looked up at him and she saw that he was not afraid. He was standing there in front of her, the King of Eldermere, with his heart in his hands, and he was not afraid of what she might see. I do not know what to call you now, she said. You have been Aldrich to me for so long. I do not know how to fit the man I have been talking to with the name Nathaniel of House Thornwood. Call me whatever you need to call me, he said. Aldrich, Nathaniel, a guard, a stranger, a man who sat with you in the dark and listened to you speak of your brother. I am all of those things. I have been all of those things to you, and I would rather be any one of them in your presence than be king anywhere else. She reached out slowly, and her fingers touched the worn leather of the sword grip. He did not flinch, he did not move. He let her touch it, let her feel the places where his hand had worn the leather smooth over 8 years of carrying it. You loved her very much, she said. I did, he said. And I thought, when she died, that I would never allow myself to feel that way again. I told myself that the weight of the crown was enough, that I did not need anyone else to carry it with me, that I was safer alone. But you are making it very difficult for me to believe that. Why? Because when I am with you, he said, I do not feel the weight. I feel the warmth. And I had forgotten what that felt like. She stood there, her hand still resting on the worn leather of the grip, her eyes on his. The last light of the day had faded, and the moon was rising over the valley, casting silver light across the old wall. I am not the same person I was when I came to this keep, she said. I was so afraid of being seen that I made myself small, I made myself invisible, and you came along and you saw me anyway, and you did not turn away. I never will, he said. She pulled her hand back from the sword, and she looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had never done before, not with anyone. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. He went very still for a heartbeat. Then his arms came around her, carefully, as if he were holding something precious and fragile. He did not squeeze. He did not rush. He simply held her, and she held him, and the moon climbed higher over the valley as they stood there, two people who had been alone for a very long time, finally not alone anymore. After a while, she pulled back just enough to look at him. You are going to have a great deal of explaining to do, she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. The king, disguised as a guard, spending his evenings with a low-ranking soldier from the Northmoor Fells. The court will talk. Let them talk, he said. I have spent my life being feared. I would rather be talked about for this than for anything I have done in battle. She laughed, a sound that surprised her, and she saw his eyes soften at the sound of it. Claire, he said, and the sound of his voice saying her name, not as a soldier's name on a record, but as a man saying the name of someone he cared for, made her chest ache in a way that was not painful. Yes, whatever you need, whatever you want, whatever it takes for you to know that you are not alone anymore, I will give it to you. Not because I am the king, because I am the man who sat with you in the dark, and I would like to sit with you in the light too. She looked at him, at the scar on his cheek and the worrings, think in his eyes, and the hope that was just beginning to flicker there, and she felt something in her heart that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she had come home. Then do not go anywhere, she said softly. That is all I need. That is all I have ever needed, someone who will stay. The summer came to Ashford Keep the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, as if the north wind were loath to give up its hold on the land. The mornings were soft with dew, the afternoons warm with the smell of new grass, and the evenings long and golden. Claire stood at the window of the small chamber that had been hers for the past 2 weeks, looking out at the courtyard where she had first practiced her sword forms in the moonlight. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been barely 2 months. She could still feel the cool flagstones under her feet, still hear the whisper of her blade cutting through the night air, still remember the prickle at the back of her neck that had made her turn and find a stranger with gray-green eyes watching her from the shadows. She smiled at the memory. She had been so certain then that she was alone in the world, so certain that no one saw her, no one noticed her, no one cared whether she stood or fell. And now, a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Come in. The door swung open, and Marin stepped inside carrying a small linen bundle that smelled faintly of dried herbs and apples. The housekeeper's sharp eyes took in Claire's travel clothes, the packed satchel on the bed, the sword belt already buckled at her waist. So you are really going, Marin said, setting the bundle on the table. I had hoped the north wind might change its mind and keep you here a while longer. Claire turned from the window, her gray-blue eye. Think, I'm half. The north wind does not change its mind, Marin. It only grows stronger. Then it is fortunate that you are made of the same stuff. The older woman unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small ceramic jar and a folded cloth. Dried apple chips and honey for the road. The honey is from the keep's own hives, and the apples are from the old tree by the courtyard gate. Claire's throat tightened. She had told no one about her fondness for apples. And yet, somehow, Marin had known. Perhaps the housekeeper knew everything about everyone in the keep. It would not have surprised her. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little rough. "I will save them for the journey." Marin nodded, then fixed Claire with a look that was both stern and warm. "Now, girl, I have been in this keep for 40 years. I have seen kings come and go, and I have seen young soldiers march out of these gates with fire in their eyes and fear in their hearts, but I have never, not once, seen our king stand at the courtyard gate at dawn, waiting to say goodbye to a departing officer." Claire's cheeks flushed. "He is the king. He sees off all his officers." "He does not," Marin said flatly. "He sends his steward. He sends a formal farewell in writing. He does not stand in the morning mist, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a man who is not certain of his welcome." Claire had no answer to that. She ducked her head, reaching for the buckle of her sword belt to check it. For the third time that morning. "I see you still do that," Marin observed, a hint of amusement in her voice. "The bowing of the head when someone pays you a kindness, the fussing with your gear when you do not know what to say. Our king does the same, you know. He fiddles with that old sword of his whenever he is moved by something he sees." "Thing I put into words." Claire looked up, startled. "He does?" "He does. I have watched him do it for the better part of a decade." Marin's voice softened. "The two of you are cut from the same cloth. Stubborn, proud, carrying wounds you do not show to anyone. It is a good thing you found each other, I think. The world has enough lonely people." Claire felt the sting of tears behind her eyes and blinked them back. "I do not know that we have found each other." "Exactly. He is the king. I am. You are the women he stood in the rain for, waiting to see if you would be all right." Marin's voice was gentle now, stripped of its usual briskness. "I was watching from the east tower that night. He did not know I was there, but I saw him. I saw him stand at the edge of the courtyard, out of the lantern light, for the better part of an hour, just watching your window to make sure your lamp was lit before he went to his own chambers." Claire's breath caught in her chest. "He is not a man who shows his heart," Marin continued. "He has been alone for so long that he has forgotten how to reach out. But he reaches for you, Claire. In his own way, he reaches. And you reach back. That is more than I ever thought I would see from that boy." "The boy," Claire repeated, a small smile tugging at her lips. "He is a king. He is a boy, who lost his mother too young and his wife too soon, and who has been carrying the weight of a crown and a kingdom on his shoulders ever since." Marin stepped forward and took Claire's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong. "You are good for him, girl. Do not let the crown blind you to the man beneath it. And do not let your own past convince you that you are not worthy of the love he is trying to give you." Claire squeezed the older woman's hand. Her eyes bright. "I will try. Trying is all any of us can do." Marin released her hands and stepped back, smoothing her apron. "Now, there is a king waiting by the gate, and if I know him at all, he is probably pacing. Go, say your goodbyes, and when you come back, and you will come back, I will have a hot apple tart waiting for you in the kitchen, the kind my grandmother used to make. The smell of it will reach you all the way from the courtyard." Claire laughed, a sound that surprised her with its lightness. "I will hold you to that, Marin. I have no doubt that you will." The housekeeper's eyes crinkled with warmth. "Now go, child. The north waits for no one, but this old keep will be here when you return." The morning mist hung low over the courtyard as Claire descended the stone steps, her satchel slung over one shoulder and her sword at her hip. The keep was just beginning to stir, a scullery maid crossing the yard with a basket of bread, a stable boy leading a horse to water, 2 guards exchanging quiet words by the gate. And there, standing at the edge of the courtyard beneath the old apple tree, was Nathaniel. He was not wearing his crown, or even his formal robes. He wore a simple dark tunic and trousers, his old sword at his belt, the faded leather grip catching the pale morning light. He looked for all the world like a man who had come to see off a friend. Claire's steps slowed as she approached him. She saw the way his hands hung at his sides, the fingers of his right hand brushing the hilt of his sword. Fiddling, Marin had called it. She saw the way his gray-green eyes tracked her every movement, as if he were memorizing the way she walked. She stopped a few paces from him, the morning air cool between them. "You did not have to come," she said softly. "I know." His voice was low, rough at the edges, as if he had not slept much. "I wanted to." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the waking keep washing over them. A bird sang somewhere in the apple tree above them. The mist began to thin, revealing the pale blue of the summer sky. "I have something for you," Nathaniel said, reaching into the folds of his tunic. He drew out a small leather pouch, worn soft with use, and held it out to her. Claire took it, her fingers brushing his. The leather was warm from his body heat. She loosened the drawstring and peered inside, then caught her breath. It was the hilt wrap from his old sword. The faded leather cord, carefully removed and coiled into a neat circle. "I know it is not much," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked almost uncertain. "But I thought you might want something to carry with you." "To remember." "To remember what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To remember that you are not alone." He met her eyes, and there was no crown, no throne, no distance between them. Just a man, standing in the morning light, offering her the most precious thing he had. "Wherever you go, wherever the north wind takes you, this is my promise, that I will be here when you come back, that there will always be a hearth waiting for you." Claire's hand closed around the leather cord, and she felt something in her chest crack open, not painfully, not like the wounds of the past, but like a door, slowly swinging open to let in the light. "Nathaniel," she said, and his name felt like a prayer on her lips. "Claire." He said it, the same way he had said it on the wall that night, not as a king addressing a soldier, but as a man saying the name of someone he treasured. She stepped forward, and thing Od closing the distance between them, and reached up to touch the scar on his cheek. He went still at the contact, but he did not pull away. He simply stood there, letting her trace the old wound with her fingertips, letting her see him. "I will come back," she said. "I will come back, and I will find you standing under this tree, and I will tell you everything about the north that you have never seen." "I would like that," he said, his voice rough. "And when I do," she continued, her hand dropping to rest on his chest over his heart, "I will expect to find that hearth burning hot and bright, because I am tired of being cold, Nathaniel. I am tired of being alone, and I think I am ready to be warm." He covered her hand with his own, his gray-green eyes bright with something she could not quite name. "Then it will burn, I promise you, Claire. It will burn for as long as you need it to." They stood like that for a long moment, the morning mist curling around them like a blessing, and then without quite knowing who moved first, they were embracing. His arms around her, her face pressed against his chest, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a declaration that would echo through the halls of Ashford Keep. It was simply two people, holding each other, promising to stay. And it was enough. The road to the north was long and winding, but Claire did not mind the journey. The summer sun was warm on her shoulders, the scent of grass and wildflowers filled the air, and in the leather pouch at her belt she carried a coil of faded cord that felt, somehow, like a promise. She thought of Nathaniel standing under the apple tree, watching her ride out of the gate. She thought of the look in his eyes, not the look of a king bidding a fail for to a subordinate, but the look of a man who had found something he did not want to lose. She thought of Marin's words, and of the old housekeeper's certainty that the two of them were cut from the same cloth, stubborn, proud, carrying wounds they did not show to anyone, and yet, somehow, they had found each other. In a moonlit courtyard, in the shadow of a keep that had seen its share of sorrow, two lonely people had learned to reach out. Claire smiled, nudging her horse into a faster pace. The north waited. Her duty waited. And beyond that, at the end of the road, a hearth would be burning. She could not wait to see it. The summer deepened, and the days grew long and golden. And every evening, as the sun sank low over the walls of Ashford Keep, a figure could be seen standing beneath the old apple tree in the courtyard. A tall man with gray-green eyes and a scarred cheek looking out toward the northern road. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood, watching, waiting. And in the kitchen, Marin would glance up from her work and smile to herself because she knew the smell of apples was not just the smell of autumn coming. It was the smell of hope, the smell of a hearth, waiting for someone to come home.
Sometimes, the bravest thing a warrior can do is lay down their armor and let themselves be seen. Claire and Nathaniel found their warmth in the cold moonlight. Have you ever found unexpected comfort when you needed it most? Share your story with me in the comments below. And if this tale touched your heart, subscribe and join us by the fire for our next journey.